am Rowan Daisel. I'm the host of Middle-earth role-playing, as well as Lord of the Rings strategy battle game. I have quite an extensive collection of Tolkien stuff. And today I thought I'd do something different because it is November 11th, which is Remembrance Day in Canada, as well as in many other countries that celebrate the end of the First World War. And like many people around the world, I have family who served in both World Wars, as well as beyond. And I'd like to share some of my collection. I know it's a little different, but hey, let's check it out. First up, we got my great-grandfather. He was born in Ireland, in County Antrim. He was a proud Orangeman, so if you know anything about Ireland, then you'll know about the orange and the green. He immigrated to Canada in 1905, where he moved to Paris, Ontario. And he got married there to my great-grandmother, and that's their first daughter, not my grandmother. And when the war broke out, he didn't enlist right away, but he did enlist in October of 1915. He was shipped to England in early 1917, and then he's trained in England for a while, part of the railway troops as well, I believe. I have his record shown in a minute. And then in March 1918, he was sent to France, and he served in the trenches during the last German spring offensive and in the Allied counterattack, which resulted in the 100 days up to Mons. He didn't come home until early 1919. So he served in the trenches, and he became a corporal. He was busted down a couple of times for being late, for overstaying his curfew. So he did get busted for that. But then he became a sapper on his request. A sapper is part of the engineering corps. And basically what they do is they do a lot of stuff behind the lines and in no man's land. So they dig mines, build roads, lay telegraph wires and railroad tracks behind the lines and in no man's land. So he did see some fighting. It did affect him later on. He had problems with alcoholism. Now these are some of the hat pins and epaulets, I guess, whatever they're called. Now not all these are his, because soldiers back then traded buttons around. Some of these could be from World War II. I'm not totally sure, but some of these are definitely World War I. The Hussars are like an Elgin, or the Elgin Regiment. There's also a button from the 48th Highlanders, as well as some naval buttons. I did have some family, great uncles who fought in the Navy. One died in the World War II. He died of appendicitis, though. It's amazing to think that things like appendicitis and mastoids would kill you back then. I had another great uncle in World War II who died. He was in the Halifax Harbor Department as a gunner. He got mumps. He got infected. Went to behind his ears. Had a mastoid, went to the operating table in Montreal. Something happened and his pressure on his brain killed him. So things like that. A lot of soldiers died from simple things like that. Like I said, another great uncle, he was in the Royal Canadian Navy out in BC. He died because of appendicitis. So things like that do happen. But these are pretty cool. These are all the buttons. These are naval ones. So who knows where my grandfather got these from. Some of these are definitely from my great-grandfather. This one, and I would say this one up here, and these Royal Canadian Engineer ones. The rest I'm not sure about. Now I come to the bigger collection. This is my own grandfather. He was born in Canada, though his father was born in England, from Hobbiton, which sounds a lot like Hobbiton. And my last name is the English derivative of a small person, short person. He served with the Royal Fusiliers at first in 1937-38, and then he quit that, or got out of it, I'm not sure which, to go back to school, became a mechanic. Now there's a picture of my grandfather was when he was with the Fusiliers, and here's another picture of him and his older brother Fred when they were in cadets. His brother Fred never served in a combat role, but he was part of the Canadian Civilian Concert Party. So basically the Canadian version of the USO. He went overseas and entertained troops in Europe. I do have a picture of when he was in Oldenburg. He signed a picture to a cousin that he happened to run into in Germany. And during World War II, he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. There's his papers right there. But he had a soft war. I won't deny that. Aero mechanic, so he fixed planes. That was his job. And here was his company. And he is right there in the middle. So he had a pretty soft war. He did go overseas in a sense. But if you have relatives that's fought in any war, you can actually write and get their war records, especially in Canada. I know the States is Ancestry.com does have the World War I records. And I do have my great-grandfather, his uncle died in France and is buried in France. In one of the war cemeteries. He fought in a Saskatchewan regiment. So there's all sorts of particulars. Here are some of the units and places that my grandfather was in. You gotta remember, at the time Canada was doing the pilot training program in Canada, where it was pretty safe from Nazi fighters going after you. So they trained in Canada. A lot of Commonwealth flyers did. So my grandfather was in Brandon, St. Thomas, Trenton, Centralia, Brantford, the Mountain View, wherever the hell that is, Toronto, Trenton, Fingal, Uplands, Moncton, New Brunswick. He did his basic training in Manitoba, Brandon, Manitoba. He was in Moncton, New Brunswick. He went to Torbay, Newfoundland, back to Toronto, Trenton, and so on and so on. He was kept after the war as a reservist to help fix the planes that were left behind. But those slowly were closed, and then he became a sergeant by 1942. Worked his way up from just a regular mechanic to a corporal to a sergeant. And he even has some of his test scores. Got 80.9, 83.3. So that's how he got his aero mechanic license. So this is pretty cool when you can get the war records. Particulars of education, and it's got your attestation papers. I also have a copy of his Air Force will and other stuff. Now, I have more stuff from him. This is his sewing kit. It still has some buttons inside it, which I think is kind of cool. You could put tobacco in there too, whatever. And he's got a package full of buttons for his uniform. I still have his RCAF hat, which is cool. The one he's wearing in that picture is the same one. He brought home a bomb, a practice bomb or a dummy. This was on fighter planes, so a Spitfire or a Hurricane. It's pretty heavy. There's the hook that would attach it to the plane. This thing is, it's got a hole in it. You can see the hole drilled inside. So it's definitely a dud. When I first got this, after my grandfather died, I took it to school when I was in grade 8. And me and my friends were like chucking it up and letting it hit the concrete. Not a smart move. I knew it was a dud, but just in case, you never know with ordnance. Not the best move to make. School could have blown up. Kids had killed. Nowadays, you can't bring stuff like that to school. They just don't let you. We also have some 50 caliber bullets from the airplanes. This one still has a shell. There's nothing in it. The priming's gone. There's the bullet. This one's kind of unique because you can actually take apart. You can take the head off. It's empty inside. You probably put like phosphorus or explosives in it. And it's the same type of caliber. Think of something like that size hitting you. That's a pretty big shell. While he was there, he also decided to make himself a nice knife. Never finished it. It's got a dull edge. Point sharp. I took this to school too as part of my Halloween costume when I was a dwarf. You can't bring stuff like this to school anymore. I played around with it so the tang's not straight like it used to be. It used to be much better looking, the hilt. But I played around with it because you can unscrew it. And when he joined, he got a gift for you. So my grandmother made a cartoon for him, and they got this little card. Proudly know the part you play. And then it was signed by the whole family at the time. Other interesting thing was gasoline license ration coupon. I found 2 of these in this little sewing pouch. The other 2 was shipped to me from my aunt. She has a whole bunch of this stuff. And it's 1 unit of gasoline. Valid only January 1st to March 31st, 1943. And every time you fill up a gas, you would give one of these coupons. It's called rationing. And here are some more gasoline coupons, all the way up to 1945. So my grandfather had these, and anytime he drove somewhere, he needed gas, he'd give one of these. Now I also have his corporal stripes from his uniform. These are the original corporal stripes and his sergeant stripes, as well as his wings, his St. John's ambulance, because he did have CPR training in case anyone crashed. They're one of the first out to the scene. Now these are his actual medals that he got after the war. He got the General Service Medal that everyone got for being a volunteer. And I really need to put these in a shadow box. And then he also got an Overseas Medal with the 1 overseas bar, even though he technically never served overseas. But he did go to Newfoundland, and any Canadians who know anything about their history will know that during World War II, Newfoundland was not part of Canada. Newfoundland was its own British colony. It was part of the British Empire and was technically not part of Canada. It didn't join Canada until after World War II in 48 or 49. So my grandfather, by being over in Torbay, was allowed to got himself an overseas medal. Like I said, I gotta say this again, because he's a mechanic and an aero mechanic, those are not the type of guys you're gonna send to get shot at. Because guys who fix planes do not get shot at unless the enemy attacks the air base. So he did have a soft war, no shame in that. He did a very important job. Helped keep the planes up to get the pilots trained so they can go overseas. So he did have an important role. It's not as sexy as being like my great-grandfather, but definitely an important part. And these are some more bars and badges and buttons. These are all from World War II. So the Air Force Ones are my grandfather's, and the Royal Canadian Ordnance Corps are my great-grandfather's. And there's my great-grandfather again. This might be in World War II. My great-grandfather in World War II, he served, because he was too old to go back to war, he did serve in the Canadian Ordnance Department. I had another great-grandfather who served in World War I. He only got as far as England in 1918. And he came home in 1919. Had the war gone on longer, he would have been in the fighting. He tried to enlist several times, but he was denied for medical reasons at the time. And it wasn't until near the end of the war, when they needed more bodies, that he was finally allowed. It's not that he didn't try, because back then if you didn't enlist, volunteer, you were considered a coward. And your neighbors who had sent their sons to fight would call you a coward. It was very much a stigma not to fight in the war. World War II was the same way. My mom's dad, my grandfather on that side, he tried to enlist 3 times. They denied him. 3 reasons why they wouldn't let him enlist, even though as hard as he tried. Because A, he was a farmer. B, he was already married. And 3, he was an only son. So that played a large part in things, because they learned from the First World War how devastating it is for only sons to get killed. Or if you have like 6 kids and they all get killed because they're in the same unit. The Fighting Sullivans in the States was one of those things. Saving Private Ryan was loosely based on the Fighting Sullivans. This is an interesting piece of my collection. This came from a great uncle who gave it to my grandfather, or my grandmother, his sister. And it is a Nazi Panzer Division hat badge. Tank there with the swastika. And accordingly, he took it from a dead German soldier, but he might have just taken it from a prisoner, for all I know. But I'm going to give it as it is and say it came off a dead body. You got to remember, in the wars, they were always swapping souvenirs, always picking up souvenirs. And depending on what it is, if you take something big, you only carry it a couple of miles before you realize what a pain in the ass it is, and how are you going to get this home before you ditch it. But things like this, they would collect. Soldiers would collect and bring home. Which is why if you go to like flea markets and stuff, you'll find or antique shops, you find tons of stuff like this lying around. But this is one that he brought and gave to his my grandfather. When my grandfather was in Newfoundland, he was part of the whaler squadron. Basically, they were looking for German U-boats and providing escort coverage for convoys coming into Torbay, Newfoundland. Next up, we have my great uncle, my grandfather's brother. He was the youngest one. He joined in 1945, but didn't graduate until 1946 after the war. But he went on to serve in the Canadian Air Force as well, and he's listed as one of the 25 great Canadian aviators. He was one of the first radar operators and radio operators on a plane. He joined at the age of 16, became a radio technician, posted to Port Nelson, BC, crewing as a radio operator on station aircraft. And during the Cold War, following advanced radio and armament training, he attended No. 2 Maritime Operational School at Greenwood in Nova Scotia, and was a radio operator on the anti-submarine Avro Lancaster. He was an instructor, spent a staff tour in Maritime Air Command in Halifax, and positioned on a U.S. Navy exchange. And he was at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia, developing anti-submarine warfare training material. Twice he went to sea on-board submarines. And on February 13, 1960, he was aboard a Martin P-5M Marlin flying boat between San Juan and Puerto Rico and Norfolk when an engine caught fire. Landing at sea, the crew quelled the fire and then started taxiing 885 kilometers back to San Juan, 2 days and 7 hours later. And then again on July 13th, he crewed a 20-hour airship patrol tracking a Soviet spy ship that was monitoring trials of a U.S. Navy submarine. And here's some of the newspaper clippings of that time. It's a world record for water taxiing. Now, he died a couple of years ago, and I talked to him in 2018. I went and saw him in Nova Scotia, where he'd been the base commander there, as well as in Comox, and he said it was the first hour or so was kind of hectic because the seas were a little rough, and you're in the water. Airmen in the water, not a good idea. But he said that they started taxiing, and it wasn't so bad. They took turns sitting up on the roof, getting a suntan, and they had after about 5 hours they had some U.S. naval ships escorting them home. So it wasn't that bad. But because of this, he also got to meet President Kennedy at a special reception. So that's kind of cool. Now this is a stock photo, but this is basically what he did. He was in one of those planes, and he was tracking Soviet submarines in the Atlantic. That was his job. Interestingly, he said his very first job after he graduated from the Air Force, so him and 200 other guys were sent to northern Alberta just below the tree line, just out of basic training, and they were given to a Indian chief, or indigenous chief as we now call it, being politically correct, and they were trained in how to survive in the woods. So survival training. And their first job was that if the Russians come over the horizon, over the north, they were to scatter and basically spy on the Russians and try and sabotage. So keep track of the Russians in the north if they came across that border. That was his first job for the first year. It's kind of cool. And here are some of his chevrons that he gave my grandfather. His sergeant stripes, his corporal stripes, and he was with the 407 Demons. That was one of his squadrons. And he gave some shots of the plane that he was on. These are stock photos. And it's quite cool. He was a very interesting guy. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in the Canadian Air Force. Now, I myself have never served in the military. I have cousins that have, and I have a niece that was in the Naval Reserves. But if I was going to do it, I was going to join the Navy. But I did not follow that path. But I did work briefly for 4.5 years at this place Armatech, and what we do is, this is the light armor vehicles, and it's ballistic protection upgrade package. So we were making the armor. General Dynamics makes the actual vehicle. We would design the armor. So these little panels you see, that's what we were making. I can still remember the number for these panels, which is which. Panel 10, panel 12, panel 9's on the other side, panel 4. The doors of the back are 20 and 22. I still remember that. These would be the Lav 3s. So when the U.S. were in Iraq at the time, and Afghanistan. So we were supplying the U.S. Marine Corps and also the Canadian military with some light armor vehicles. Pretty cool. This is all composite material. Hardly any metal on the armor. Projectiles would go through 10 sheets of 1-inch thick metal steel plates, but our stuff, this stuff, it only cracks it. It might penetrate a little bit inside before it gets caught in the carbon fibers. It's really strong stuff. It's really cool. It's light compared to steel. But that's all from my military collection. You got to remember Tolkien himself served in the trenches of World War I, and he did do his part in World War II at home. And his son Christopher was in the Air Force. And he knew about war, and Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit have war scenes. That's why it's called War of the Ring. And that's why we have MERP and Games Workshop. So I thought this would be good for Remembrance Day, and anyone else who has family in the military or had relatives, ancestors who fought in World War I and World War II, let me know in the comments section, and hope you guys enjoyed the collection. This is pretty cool, I think. Till next time, I'm Roman Daisel. I'm out of here.